The United Nations Refugee Agency has labelled the current developments in the Russia and Ukraine conflict as the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. This, as a reported 1.5 million people have been forced to flee their homes and cross the borders into neighbouring countries. Now, the UNHCR has warned that unless there is an immediate end to the ongoing conflict, countless more people's lives will be uprooted. But for more on the refugee situation, we are joined now by Laura Padoan, who is the UNHCR's Regional Relations Officer in the South African multi-country office. It's good to have you on Morning Live. Thanks very much for joining us, Laura.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So this is an unprecedented, what we've been saying, and in the introduction as well, 1.5 million refugees so far, and I'm sure that number is growing by the second. Something like this hasn't been seen since World War II. I don't imagine there's a way of expressing what is going on, but perhaps you can tell us from colleagues that are working on the situation what it's like.
Yes, that's right. This is now the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Since the 24th of February, 1.5 million people from Ukraine have now fled into neighbouring countries to Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and the numbers are rising by the hour. Most of the arrivals are women and children. They're arriving in neighbouring countries with very, very little. So we need to get aid and assistance to them as a matter of urgency. It's life-saving aid that we're delivering. If the conflict continues, we estimate that around 12 million people in Ukraine will be in need of assistance, and we predict that around 4 million people will be forced to cross into neighbouring countries and will be desperately in need of aid and protection. Rarely have we seen an exodus of people on this scale.
Yeah. When we talk about the amount of people that are going from these countries, all coming from the Ukraine, how many people are the UNHCR predicting that they're going to have to look after? Because at the end of the day, this is what's going on, is that these people that are fleeing now become refugees. What is the number you're looking at?
Well, as I say, we predict that around 4 million people will flee the country. But at the moment, what we're seeing is that it's very difficult to actually get out of the country. This weekend, we were expecting a humanitarian corridor to be in place so that both aid agencies could deliver core relief items to people who are trapped in cities, and so that civilians could leave the towns where they're currently in hiding in fear of the bombs and attacks. Unfortunately, that humanitarian corridor hasn't been put in place. So that's meant that people are now trapped in cities and towns in Ukraine. So we've seen heartbreaking scenes this weekend from Mariupol, from other areas such as Irpin on the outskirts of Kiev, which means that people are now trapped and it's very, very difficult for them to flee. So we are calling now on all sides of the conflict to respect a ceasefire. Civilians are being targeted and they should not be, and civilian infrastructure should not be targeted. There needs to be safe passage out for people so that they can access safety in a neighbouring country where their lives will be safe.
Yeah, I'm seeing a report just coming through right now, breaking on here, saying that Russia to open humanitarian corridors in several Ukrainian cities on French President Emmanuel Macron's request. So here we go again. As you say, this we've tried to see the whole weekend. Let's hope that this now is something that will be a much more smooth running process.
Well, absolutely, because in several parts of Ukraine, the humanitarian situation is increasingly dire. So we've seen supply chains, including for medical supplies, water, power, are being cut off. So people are in desperate need of those humanitarian corridors. We've seen critical infrastructure destroyed, and it's very, very difficult now for civilians who are in hiding to survive with limited access to food, water and power. It's also very difficult for our staff to operate. So UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, we are in Ukraine. We're delivering assistance where it is needed, but our operations are being severely hampered by the security situation. Our staff are staying and delivering. They're setting up reception centres for people who are internally displaced and who are managing to flee Kiev in the south and the west of the country. We're also ramping up our supplies of aid in neighbouring countries. So we're airlifting core relief items, blankets, tents, sleeping mats, baby kits, hygiene kits to Moldova, and we're also ramping up assistance in neighbouring countries as well.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the donations have been coming in from, individuals like myself and anybody that's watching, and also from a lot of corporates, businesses, people that are looking on and saying, how do we help? What can we do? And they are donating into the UNHCR to try and assist. The last I heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you'll know more, but around about $40 million has been raised, if not more. What are we looking at in terms of the money so far that has been put towards this cause?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Leanne, you've been a great supporter of refugees, and also, everyone in South Africa and across the world for the solidarity, the donations that have been sent to the people fleeing Ukraine. Support is much, much needed. We've seen tremendous generosity from the communities along the borders, people driving across Europe with supplies, offering donations to refugees from Ukraine who are arriving with very, very little. So that's incredibly welcome. I need to stress that the needs are immense. We issued an appeal last week for $1.7 billion. That's a joint UN appeal to meet the needs of the people of Ukraine who are fleeing their homes and fleeing into neighbouring countries. We urgently need donations and assistance. So any help that can be offered is much, much appreciated. Donating to organisations like UNHCR and others that are operating to provide assistance is really very welcome.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing our South African organisation, the Gift of the Givers, are now going to mobilise as much as they can, get onto the ground and start helping and working in the Ukraine. So that is something that, we're very, very proud of and happy that they can offer assistance. Let's talk about what, it's one thing to watch the situation unfolding, and we always do. While it's in the headlines, we're watching it, we're seeing millions of people flooding into other countries and becoming refugees and being set up in, makeshift homes or being housed by very generous people that are saying, come and stay with us. But this is the start of the unknown, and the reality is that this is where things go very, very wrong. What happens to these people? Yes, in the beginning they receive whatever it may be when they get across the border, but in terms of their lives thereafter, what happens to a refugee if the situation, as we've been hearing, is expected to go on for years after this?
Yes, you're absolutely right. When a person flees their home, when they become a refugee, no one plans that step. No one thinks that move will be permanent. People are fleeing in conditions of fear and desperation, taking with them only what they can carry in their arms. So people aren't expecting to be away from their homes for a very long time. It can happen to anybody in an instant. We have seen the EU offering a temporary protection visa to people of Ukraine who are fleeing, which means that they will have automatic legal residence within EU countries, and that's very, very welcome. Of course, the thing that every refugee feels in their heart is that they want to go home. That's always the case. No one wants to be a refugee. No one chooses to become a refugee. We don't know at this stage when the security situation will allow for people to go home. So at the moment, we are very much in the emergency stage. We're rushing aid to meet people's urgent needs where they are, setting up temporary accommodation sites. But of course, looking longer term, we don't know how sustainable that will be. We will need other countries in Europe and around the world to offer solidarity and support to the people of Ukraine. If conditions do not allow, if the security situation continues to deteriorate, there will need to be longer-term solutions. We are looking into an unknown situation. At the moment, this is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. We don't know whether conditions will allow people to return home safely. At the moment, we can only plan for a humanitarian response in the short term, in the coming weeks and months, and very much hope that conditions improve and that both parties come to a negotiated ceasefire so that we're not seeing civilians running for their lives.
Yeah, indeed. You know, there has been, and I think we'd be amiss not to point out these criticisms that have also been directed at how this crisis has been handled. If we juxtapose it to what we've seen happening in Syria, what we've seen happening in Africa, what we've seen happened in Asia, there has never been a response like this to nations like that. So, you know, a lot of people saying that there really is just a very different way that this has been treated in comparison to other crises, and there have been. I mean, we're saying that this is the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. But we have seen a crisis on the African continent, in Syria, in the Middle East, in Asia, that is just as dramatic. But it seems to get drowned in the headlines, and nobody really pays attention to this. What do you think is behind this?
You're absolutely right to point this out. We have said again and again that there should be no discrimination between people who are fleeing. Everybody should be granted protection and have the right to asylum regardless of their nationality and their race. The world spotlight should also be focused on conflicts and on human rights abuses where people have to flee in Africa, in the Middle East and across the world. Currently, the news spotlight is on Ukraine. We also shouldn't forget that millions of people around the world are in need of protection. In Africa, they're fleeing conflicts in DRC, from Somalia. We're seeing people who have been displaced from Afghanistan, from Yemen. We should not forget that there are people desperately in need of asylum, and that we also need to find solutions for those people as well. Currently, the emergency situation in Ukraine is such that we are focusing our efforts in Europe there, but that does not mean at all that refugees in Africa have been forgotten. And UNHCR is working around the clock to ensure that refugees here have access to asylum and that their needs aren't forgotten. There's also the reports that have come through from the way that some of the refugees, particularly from Africa and Asia, I mean, we've had South Africans that were stuck at the borders as well, that were treated very, very badly, that were trying to get across into neighbouring countries to seek refuge, and they were told to so-called go stand in the black line, or when they arrived, they were treated terribly. And I know you say that they should be treated as equal and to anybody else, but would you by any chance know? I mean, the Africans, Middle Easterns, those citizens, are they going to be offered this same treatment from the European Union that others are going to be? Ukrainians, for instance, are they also going to be given this visa where they'll be able to stay in Europe, or does this not apply to them? Well, UNHCR considers all people fleeing Ukraine, regardless of their race and nationality, to be refugees. We have made it very clear that the reports of racism and discrimination at Ukraine's borders are completely unacceptable. Nobody should be treated differently, should be prevented from fleeing the country because of the colour of their skin. Now, the UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi has personally discussed this issue with authorities at the highest level, and measures are now in place to make sure that people aren't experiencing this. We're following up with authorities, with partners, with people of concern who have experienced racism. But even if there is one incident of racism, it is too many. We've been assured that these are not state policies. We will continue to intervene to ensure that everybody is received in the same manner. The Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs has set up a hotline to assist foreign nationals who are trying to leave the country. And we are taking this issue incredibly seriously because everybody has the right to asylum, regardless of their nationality or race.
Yeah, I mean, we do know that this is a global problem. It really is, and it's something that we can never ever just isolate into what is happening in the Ukraine. And I think that that's the idea that we need to get, is that there is so much of this. I mean, in fact, I just saw a piece of, I think it was Angelina Jolie, who's arriving in Yemen, where, you know, there are almost forgotten worlds out there, that this crisis is so big and been going on for so long, and people are so desperate that, you know, you just think, well, you know, they're not Europeans, so it doesn't matter. And these are the kind of things that we've been hearing in mainstream media, which is very, very disturbing. And it almost uncovers the systematic racism that we are seeing. And this is very, very worrying. And I do respect the work that the UNHCR does, because it is everywhere. But I mean, this must worry you when it comes to the relief measures and the funding that you get for the various countries. And you notice the difference that happens between different countries and the urgency if there is a war, say, in Europe compared to Africa.
Absolutely. And now Special Envoy Angelina Jolie arrived in Yemen this weekend, because there is a pledging conference to make sure that the people who are facing dire humanitarian situation with lack of food, lack of medical supplies in Yemen aren't forgotten. We absolutely have to keep making the case for refugees all around the world, not just from Ukraine, because the needs are immense. But, you know, the people, forced displacement is one of the most pressing issues that our generation will be facing. So it's vital that we don't forget about people who are fleeing from conflict, whether that's from Ukraine or around the world.
All right, Laura, we have to leave it there. Thank you. And good luck, Godspeed to all of your colleagues that are working tirelessly at this. But thanks for updating us. Thank you very, very much. Laura Padoan is the UNHCR's External Relations Officer for South Africa Multi-Country Office, talking to us about the refugee and the crisis that's happening in Ukraine, but also touching on other countries that are affected by this and continents.